So this is part two. The other one got cut off because I don't have enough memory on my phone. Now, so as I was saying, that the impact has been unexpected. I don't think that when the government wanted to, either in Thailand or in Singapore, when the government was trying to formalize the food stalls, I don't think anybody ever said, "All right, we're going to have a situation now where the Malays, which were perhaps overrepresented in the food business, at least in the hawker stalls, are suddenly underrepresented over time." But this is where unintended consequences come in. That's the economic theory, or that you try to do one thing, whether you're a government or even a corporation that passes some sort of internal guideline, and it may be the case that you accomplish your objective, but at the expense of another, or in other words, you create another problem that's unexpected. So in this case, this is the perfect example of unintended consequences. In this case, the government got what it wanted, whether in Bangkok or whether in Singapore. It was able to create a situation where it brought an informal structure, street food, into a formal structure with developers, with helpful situations where each hawker center could now be tracked, would now be given a license, and so on. The unintended consequences, of course, were suddenly you have this formal structure that might be unfamiliar to some of the people who are making your food. And those people might also not be able to afford the higher rents that go into the development of these new hawker centers. And again, now you have a situation, at least in Singapore, where the government, as far back in 2001 and even earlier, was very cognizant of its status in terms of its status as a very diverse nation, and wanted to ensure social harmony. Or you could even argue it wanted to engineer social harmony. And it, for the most part, did. That's what's so remarkable about Singapore, is that the social cohesion here, at least in 2001, was phenomenal. Whether you were an elite or so-called poor or middle class, for the most part, you were proud to be Singaporean. And part of that, I think, comes from being able to share food. Part of it comes from the public transportation system. And now, ultimately, this actually goes back to what hedge fund manager Jim Rogers says. He says that there's all kinds of ways for governments to maintain legitimacy. But one of the easiest ways, or one way, would be to provide housing and food. In other words, to provide the essentials. And that's exactly what Singapore has done. Its model has been, we're going to subsidize certain aspects of life, especially the essentials, and we're going to see where that goes. And in this case, obviously, the economic gains since 2001, and even before then, have been undeniably phenomenal. But again, we talk about unintended consequences, where you now have many more KFCs, many more formalized structures that I didn't see 15 years ago or 16 years ago when I was here. And my argument is that the Singaporean government, which passed all these laws in order to create a more sanitary experience, not just that, but also to create a situation where you could now at least put all these hawker centers on a map. You could track them. You can go digital and create even more centralized engineering. You could create a system where you can now build condos or housing projects nearby these hawker centers, making sure that everyone has access to at least one or two nearby. There's all sorts of things you can do. But again, I don't think the intent was to make the food business a little bit more expensive, thereby giving preferences to corporate developers. But that's exactly what's happened. If you go into any sort of establishment, you see a preference for KFCs, even though they're right next to, or in many cases nearby, a hawker stall style in center within the same mall. And what you would say here is that, again, that's unintended consequences. Now, because the Singaporean government, at least in 2001, had quotas to make sure that the Malays never fell behind, and that they were included as part of the country's move forward. And it's remarkable what has happened. But again, one of those consequences is when you insert yourself in, and this is America's argument for less regulation, is when you insert yourself in one way, in many cases you either reduce the efficacy of a prior program, or you create unintended consequences that now might need other government programs to promote whatever the original intent was. So, now Hernando de Soto would say, well, listen, this is exactly what should happen. We want these smaller businesses that are formally disconnected from each other and have no political voice to be part of a formalized structure. And the reason for that is now they can get access to credit. Now they know they have an address that's permanent, semi-permanent. And if they have a problem with a corrupt police officer, they can go down to the police station and say, I pay taxes, here's my address, I've been here for 5 years, here's my license, you need to help me. And, the Soto's argument against what I've just said would be, what I've said in terms of having minimal to no regulation of these hawker centers, of these food stalls, would be, number one, what do you do if there's a corrupt police officer? That person now, even if he goes to a police station, would not get the same level of respect as somebody who is paying taxes, or at least is guaranteed to pay taxes now that they're part of that more formalized system. The other argument that De Soto would probably say would be, well, that we're not just talking about, outliers in the police department. We're not talking about corruption in the police department. What about just mafia? And what do you do if you're not part of that system? Then the mafia can come in and demand protection money. And again, you're not tied into a formal system, so you have less pull or less of a claim on police services. Now, this is what De Soto would say. And the counter response to that would be, well, if you're a small hawker center in the middle of nowhere, chances are the mafia is not going to be interested in your, 5% margin or your, $100 or, a week. And the idea would be that even if they were, the real problem would be having too much dispersed, issues. In other words, the real problem wouldn't be, not being tied sufficiently to your government. The real problem would be competitors might notice, hey, this guy's making some good money. Why don't I set up a stall next to him? And then suddenly you've got a dispute, in terms of who can sell what and so on. So the idea really would be not just what those problems are in terms of representation within that political structure, but also just who do you talk to and who resolves issues, in the small business sector. And you've got the black market as well. And De Soto's whole argument is, the black market is terrible, but people are forced to go into it. And my argument is you want to create, and my counter argument to that is you want to create a system where, the government can incorporate smaller businesses, especially individually owned businesses, into the panoply of government protection in ways that give them a voice and give them trust within that system, even if they're not paying the same level of taxes as a KFC. And so my ultimate conclusion between the so-called differences between the West and the East, or the capitalism with a Chinese face, and so on, is that ultimately it all depends on the integrity within each government's programs, and also the humility to realize when you've maybe overshot on some regulation. And because what you don't want is a system that layers regulation on top of regulation in order to fix a problem that was created by prior legislation. What you want is a practical government with integrity that recognizes when it's gone too far astray and then attempts to fix it. And that's exactly what, ironically, that's exactly what Singapore stands for. When you listen to Lee Kuan Yew, LKY, that's literally his almost his verbatim, his exact words, where he says, we're going to try it. If it doesn't work, we're going to throw it out and try something else. And our competitive advantage in this region is integrity. And that's ultimately what makes everything work. And I think he's absolutely right about that. Now, we've talked about the American system, we've talked about the Soto, and we can talk about the Singaporean system. And the Singaporean system, because it's such a small country, will argue that the American system is fine. It may take us a little bit longer to get some programs rolled out because we have a centralized system. But ultimately they work. And if they don't work, people have faith in us that, and given our prior track record, which is remarkable, it's astounding. I don't think there's been a nation in history that's managed to progress so quickly, and so qualitatively as Singapore. It's known as having the #1 educational system in the world. Now, whether that's based on a few tests, but ultimately the National University is the top in all of Asia. They have something called another entity called Nanyang Technological University. That's also typically in the top 5 in all of Asia. So you have to remember, these people, if you look at all of Asia, they're competing with China, 1 billion people, much more money. They're still able to outperform all of their neighbors. And again, this is unbelievably remarkable. And the difference between 2001 and now, which would be the argument against, what I'm saying is that, sure, you have fewer hawker centers, but have you noticed all the different housing projects that have gone up? They're everywhere now. Much more so than when I visited in 2001, and that's because we have so much demand for permanent residency. We have so much demand for people coming in that you're complaining about something that's very small. We've actually managed to make almost everyone who's a citizen a homeowner since 2001. And not only have we done that, we've created a savings mechanism that where if you work for a Singaporean company, you're going to save about 37% of your income coming in, which we then use to put into a venture capital fund that then allows us to compound our prosperity by not just investing within the country and within infrastructure, but also within worldwide. Whether it's in Google's healthcare, health sciences division, or anything else. And that would be the argument that somebody would make against what we've just talked about today, which is what happens, unintended consequences, and also regulation. And my response to that would be, this is all fine, but it's possible to be affluent as a society but still lack social cohesion. And once again, what I'm saying is not different from what LKY was saying. LKY was saying the same things I'm saying. And ultimately we have to bring the country together simply because we don't have a choice in Singapore. We're a diverse country. We cannot afford, a small country, we cannot afford to have a lack of social cohesion. And the argument is that, these small changes over time have serious consequences. And so when someone like me walks outside and is not able to go into a hawker center that's as diverse as it was before, where have all those people gone? Have they all received other government jobs? And to be clear, the number of government jobs here is really interesting because when you walk into a library, you actually have somebody at the very, greeting you like a Walmart type situation, right there at the entrance. And you also have multiple people, who are helpers. They have a vest on that say, if you have any questions, ask me. And you're not going to see that in libraries in the United States. Not even, perhaps in Canada or other places that, might have a different economic system. So the question is, where have those, is the government able to keep up with the progress that it creates on its own? Because that's really what the government will say, is that we have fewer hawker centers, we have less, dispersion, and as a result of that, we've been able to expand massively and create many, many more housing projects and housing towers that would not have otherwise, existed, certainly not at the same level, had we allowed a sort of loose network of small businesses and individually owned businesses to operate outside of a formal structure. And that's actually what De Soto talks about. That's his whole point, is that now we have to be a part of a system and it has to work together. And what I'm suggesting is that there's something, again, that's a sociological aspect or a political aspect that's being ignored in this analysis, in this economic analysis of prosperity, and which is, and I don't even think we have language that really expresses it very well, which is one reason why we're not able to discuss it very well. But it's simply a feeling that we may have more money, but less of another important aspect. And I can tell you that people seemed to be happier when they had, when there weren't so many formalized structures. And I can't quantify that. And that's really the problem with economics, is that I can have an opinion, but because I can't quantify it very well, especially if I haven't been in the country and able to gather data, whether anecdotally or otherwise, I certainly don't have a credible leg to stand on if I try to argue against the weight of the evidence, especially with economic numbers, that something is missing. There's really no way to do it. And I think that's really the problem with economics. Is that it sort of excludes from its purview the type of journalism that was taken for granted in some parts of America, which is through someone called Studs Terkel, Terkel, which is you actually get a lot of data just by talking to people and assuming that you have credibility that would allow them to be open with you and to be honest with you. And that's where economics fails. It doesn't have that ability to capture anecdotal data. And even if you try to do that, the question is whether or not that anecdotal data will be reliable and honest. And so this is where we have a gap. But hopefully we've talked about all this, and hopefully at least it gives you a start into seeing differences between the American system, which wants to get a product out as quickly as possible, knowing that there may be flaws, but also knowing that the lawyers will be able to come in and try to fix those flaws over time. That's the idea on paper with the American system, is that we have this fragmented system, this patchwork system, but it's better, especially in a larger country, given the size of the United States, it's better than having or waiting until the federal government comes up with a plan and then distributes that plan nationwide. Especially because the quality of whatever objective existed at the time of the formulation of the plan will probably not be implemented properly or to specifications as it's implemented. So the difference between that is in Singapore, you really can implement a centrally planned government program and make it work, and that's actually literally what Singapore has done. And when it declares something, when it wants to do something, it almost always does it. And I think this is something where we look around and we talk about economic systems, we talk about different philosophies, but ultimately the measure of success is, can you get it done? And I mentioned this before, is that every time America declares a war, it fails. Whether it's a war on poverty, whether it's a war on drugs, it has always failed, which gives you an idea of why Americans are so skeptical of national programs. But in Singapore, it's the exact opposite. The so-called capitalism with a socialist face might actually work simply because it's a smaller country, and not only that, but every time the government has come up with a problem, it's fixed that problem. And the real question, and my complaint really has to do with abstract issues that are not economically captured very well in the numbers. And sort of a warning, if you will, but how do we capture this sort of intangible, the intangibles of what makes a community? Certainly we've progressed economically, but the question is, how do we create a indicator of some sort that also allows us to capture, stories about people and how things have changed. And I think that's one reason journalism is so important. And we certainly see that the absence of it, the impact of the absence of journalism in America. And we can see that, I think, in other countries that I think over time will start to realize the importance of honest journalism, even if it's just to keep a historical record that captures not just a singular viewpoint or the viewpoint of the majority, but everyone's viewpoint, and in doing so creates a system where everyone feels as if they're included in the progress of a country, and at least in ways that say that we care about what you have to say. Let's gather this data and let's try to figure out how we can fix it, so that we are not open to complaints about, say, punishing people who don't vote for the dominant political party or who are sort of cowed into silence simply because of the allegation that things have worked before, and because things have worked before, they certainly must work in the future. And that's of course not true. Past performance is not indicative always or predictive of future results. And this goes back to whether or not countries, despite having so much more to progress so far, whether or not they're able to maintain that momentum. And especially after the citizens have achieved a certain level, a certain standard of quality of life, what happens then? And again, I keep going back to, there actually is this other angle that we're missing out on in economics. It's not just a political angle, but it's also this anecdotal angle, this feeling that, maybe things are not as socially cohesive as the data might, indicate. And the question is, how do we incorporate that anecdotal, informal data into a formal system?